Hello and welcome to the conclusion of our Thursday night Bible study on the covenants. And so tonight we're going to be talking about the summary and conclusion of the covenants. And you might get this at some other time, but today is December, I think today's December the 8th. Might be December the 7th. I'm not sure. Let me check my watch here. Yeah, today's December the 8th. So you might get this today sometime, or this evening, or tomorrow, but we are concluding our study of the covenants. We have worked through the different covenants of the Bible in relation to God's plan for history, and we're going to bring that to an end, and we're going to take the rest of the month of December off. We're going to come back in the new year, and we'll begin the next part of our study of this series entitled God's Plan for History. And that next part is looking at the theme of the kingdom of God. The kingdom of God. So that ought to be a very interesting study. Many people are very confused about that. Either confused, ignorant, misled, or any number of other things, but they don't have clarity over what the kingdom of God is and what that means for what God is doing in history. So for our lesson tonight, there's a PDF on our website. So if you just go to our website, and on that website, along the top bar there, the navigation bar, you'll see different things. If you go to sermons, if you just put your cursor on sermons, you'll get a drop-down box that says notes. Click on the notes and go to today's date, and you'll find a set of notes entitled Summary and Conclusion of the Covenants, and it gives a PDF copy of the different slides we'll be looking at today. So let's go ahead and move on with our study. And the first thing I want to do is I want to, again, review the definition of a covenant. Now, everything we're going to talk about in this lesson, we've already talked about in depth. So this is just sort of a review and a bringing of things together. So there's not going to be any in-depth explanations here. I just want to talk about, as a way of review, a few different things to kind of conclude this part of our study. So a covenant is a binding contract between two parties with specific obligations and blessings. Okay, that's just the general definition of a covenant. So it's a binding contract. So it's like a legal contract. You know, when you go into a contract to buy a home, or you contract with somebody to do a certain work for you, your binding contract. They're going to do something for you, and you're going to do something from them. So it's a contract between two parties, and these parties might be individuals or they might be groups, but two parties. And a covenant, as a binding contract, also has specific obligations. Each party would get obligations, and then there's blessings or reward. I guess it wouldn't be reward really as a part of a covenant, but you get something from the covenant, some type of what's the word I'm looking for? You have obligations that you got to do. In return, you get what you've contracted for, whatever the word is for that. So a covenant is not simply an agreement, although agreement is involved in it. So it's not just an agreement. It's not like you can go out and say, hey, we're going to do a handshake on this. That's not what a covenant is. A covenant is a binding contract. Okay, so it's more than an agreement. Yes, it involves agreement, but it's more than agreement. Also, a covenant is not merely a promise. It's not just promising to do something. So there's all sorts of promises in the Bible. Many of which God is promising to do something. Well, all God's promises are not covenants. Okay, you can't do that because it reduces what these promises are, and it sort of makes a covenant vague, and you just can't do that. So a covenant, while it involves promises, is not merely a promise. It's a binding contract made between two parties. Okay. Also, a covenant is not a command. There's commands involved in a covenant. You do this, and you get this, so do this. But a covenant is not just a command. They're not the same things. A covenant's a binding contract between two parties with certain blessings, responsibilities, and even penalties that are involved in it. So that's what a covenant is. Now let's take a look at the definition of a biblical covenant. A biblical covenant. So a biblical covenant is a covenant that God makes with man. So God makes it. So when we talk about the biblical covenants, we're not just talking about covenants in the Bible, but we're talking about these covenants that God makes. I mean, when you look at the word covenant in the Bible, you don't have to go very far till you find that two men are making covenants. For example, in Genesis, Abimelech makes a covenant with Abraham. Okay, so that's two men making a covenant. Well, yes, that's in the Bible, but what I mean when I talk about biblical covenants is a covenant that God makes with man or men as a group. It could be either way. And that these covenants are specifically mentioned in the Bible. So it's got to be mentioned as a covenant in the words of the Bible in order to be a biblical covenant. So here's the requirements for a biblical covenant. It's a covenant that God makes with man, and it's a covenant that is specifically mentioned as a covenant in the Bible. For example, the covenant that God makes with Noah in creation is a biblical covenant. Okay? It's called a covenant, and God makes the covenant. The covenant that God makes with the nation of Israel on Mount Sinai is a biblical covenant. It's the Mosaic covenant. It's called a covenant, and God makes this covenant. So that's what a biblical covenant is. Now, this also means that the so-called theological covenants of covenant theology are not biblical covenants and are rejected. Okay, so in covenant theology, and we've talked about covenant theology. If you don't know what that is, Google it real quick on your computer, and you'll find out. But in covenant theology, they hold to three covenants. Most of them hold to three covenants. They say there's a covenant of works, a covenant of redemption, and a covenant of grace. And again, you can look all those up on the internet. But these are not biblical covenants. They are theological covenants. That means that they are covenants that have been deduced from their system of theology, not from the Bible. And so I want to draw this distinction between biblical covenants and theological covenants. And on top of that, I also want to give a warning about listening to people who hold to these theological covenants. Okay? Now, what I'm not saying here is they don't have anything good to say, that people who are covenant theologians who hold to these theological covenants, that they have nothing good to say. I'm not saying they aren't believers, but I am saying be careful when you listen to them. If you listen to them, be careful when you listen. Be discerning, because what they say, in large part, is going to be based on their view of their theological covenants. So who are some of these people that you need to be careful about reading and listening to? Well, R.C. Sproul, who's no longer with us. He died several years ago, so he knows better now. He's a covenant theologian. So what he says is clouded by these three covenants of covenant theology. Also, Tim Keller, another really popular writer, Christian writer, speaker, who was a pastor for years and New York City, and more of a younger guy, an up-and-coming guy, gaining more an influence, writing more and speaking more to a wider audience, and that's Kevin DeYoung. Again, all of these men say some things that are good, but you got to be careful. You got to be careful in discerning what they say. So we have stuck, in our study here, we have stuck with only looking at the biblical covenants. We're only interested in the biblical covenants. So these are the covenants that God makes with men that are specifically mentioned in the Bible as covenants. Now, I'm going to narrow things down even a little bit more. So we're not just talking about a covenant or covenants. We're not just talking about the biblical covenants. We're talking about the biblical eschatological covenants. Now, that's a big word, eschatological. I want to give it a description of this. So the first thing we notice is that the biblical eschatological covenants are those covenants that are fulfilled or are related to the end times. The term eschatology means the study of the end times, the study of the last things. Okay, so we are only interested in those biblical covenants that deal with, related to, or are fulfilled with the things around the end times. For example, the Mosaic covenant doesn't really deal with the end times. It doesn't tell us anything about the end times events as described in the Bible. So it is not a biblical eschatological covenant. Okay, so that we're only interested in the biblical eschatological end times covenants that relate to the end times. Furthermore, we're going to narrow things down just even one more step. And we have focused in this study on the biblical eschatological Israelite covenants. Okay, so it's not just the covenants, it's not just the biblical covenants, it's not just the biblical eschatological covenants, it's the biblical eschatological Israelite covenants, the covenants that deal with Israel that are related to or are fulfilled at the end times. So these are the covenants that we have focused on in this particular study in our series. Now, let me give you a quick example of a covenant that's a biblical covenant, that's a biblical eschatological covenant, but it's not a Israelite covenant. Okay? That's the Noahic covenant. The Noahic covenant is biblical. It's mentioned as a covenant in the Bible. God makes it with man. It is also eschatological because it has a focus on judgment, and judgment will come at the end. Okay, and this focus on judgment is essentially this. God says he won't again judge the world with water. In other words, another way to put that is when he judges the world again, it's not going to be with water, it's going to be with fire. All right, so it is, in a sense, biblical, eschatological, but it's not just to Israel. It's not just to the Jewish people, so it's not Israelite. All right, so in our study, we have focused on 4 particular covenants, and these 4 particular covenants are biblical covenants, mentioned in the Bible as covenants. They're eschatological covenants. They deal with, relate to, or are fulfilled at the end times. And they're Israelite covenants. They're to the nation of Israel. And these covenants are the Abrahamic covenant, the land covenant, some people call it the Palestinian covenant, the Davidic covenant, and the new covenant. So let's take a look at these. Well, there you go. That's what I gave to you. Those are the 4 covenants that we can label as. And I know it's a long label, and people like things short and sweet, but this is a descriptive label of these covenants: biblical, eschatological, Israelite covenant. So let's take a look at the Abrahamic covenant now. Okay, the Abrahamic covenant. Now we're going to go, it's going to follow the same pattern as we look at each of these covenants. So again, just pay attention to your screen or your notes that you got from the church website. So passages. So these are the main passages. These aren't all the passages that obviously mention the Abrahamic covenant, but these are the key ones that you need to have in your mind when you're thinking about the Abrahamic covenant. And you see they're all found in Genesis here. So these are good places to start and just go in order. And you find out a whole lot of information about the Abrahamic covenant. Now the provisions of these covenants, again, this is a covenant made to Abraham. Abraham will be a great nation. Many peoples will come from him. He's going to be prosperous. He's given a land. Kings are going to come from him. This is a covenant that's passed on. It's in a covenant in perpetuity. Passed on, goes to Isaac and then Jacob. And then finally, all peoples of the earth are going to be blessed through Abraham in some way. So these are the provisions of the covenant. The nature of the covenant is unconditional and everlasting. Unconditional simply means God's going to fulfill his part of the covenant regardless of what Abraham does. God's going to fulfill, and it's everlasting. Covenant simply means it's going to last forever. It's going to at no time will this covenant ever be taken away. Okay, it's always going to be enforced. It's never going to be taken away. So that's the nature of the covenant. The develop of the covenant, we see the development of this covenant and the fact that it's passed on and given to both Isaac, the son of Abraham, and Jacob, the grandson of Abraham. And it has to go in that specific order. Probably another passage you can put in there would be Romans chapter 9, where it shows this as well. So, it is the Abrahamic covenant that establishes the foundational promises that all the other covenants we're going to look at are based upon. Okay, it's the foundation promises. Now, fulfillment. When will the Abrahamic covenant be fulfilled? Now, it could be argued that the Abrahamic covenant has been fulfilled in part or partially fulfilled at this present time. There are a few reasons why I don't think you can maintain that position. Number one, Abraham nor his descendants have ever possessed all the land that God gave to Abraham. So that the land promise involved in the Abrahamic covenant hasn't happened. Secondly, when it talks about Abraham being a great people or a great nation, what does that mean? What does it mean? Does it mean that they will be feared by other nations? I don't think so. Does it mean that they'll be numerous? I mean, there will be many, many people. Well, no. God says, in fact, that is not a reason why he chose them. Does it mean that they will be powerful and influential? I don't think that's what it means either. I think when it talks about Abraham will be a great nation, I think it is talking about a time when the nation of Israel will be the preeminent nation on the face of the earth. Isaiah 60 helps describe that to us. Okay, there's going to be a time where something totally unique is going to happen with the nation of Israel. They will be the preeminent, predominant nation on the face of the earth. That has never been true of them up to this point in history. So sometime in the future, this is going to happen. Now, for those of us who have studied end times things, we would call this the millennium. This will happen in the millennium. And so I would say that the Abrahamic covenant will be fulfilled at right before, right at the beginning, right at the start of the millennium, the millennial kingdom. So this is the Abrahamic covenant. Let's move on to the land covenant. The land covenant. Here's our passages for the land covenant. And again, this covenant is referred to throughout the Bible. Throughout the Bible. So these are just some of the first passages that talk about it, that lay the foundation for it. The provisions, it's a physical land area. A actual, physical, earthly land area. It's a land where Abraham and his descendants, the people of Israel, will possess, that God has given them, a specific land that God has given them to possess. It encompasses, at a minimum, everything that Abraham saw in Genesis chapter 13. Now, there's some disagreement on the exact boundaries of this land area. But whatever they are larger, these boundaries are larger than what the nation of Israel has ever possessed to the present day. In other words, at no time in history has Israel possessed all the land that God has promised them. And so the provision of the land covenant is a physical land area, actual, real, earthly land area. It's a very specific one. So the nature of this covenant is that, just like the Abrahamic covenant, it's unconditional and everlasting. Okay, it means the same thing. Development. This covenant's not really developed that much. It is developed in a sense that in different places we see reference to different expressions of the boundary limits, and so it can be developed in that. But that's not so much the most important thing about it. Probably the most important thing about it is repeated over and over throughout the entire Bible. This land covenant, this promise that God has made, the covenant on which that promise is based, is mentioned throughout the Bible. You just can't avoid it. And the fulfillment of this will be the millennial kingdom. The millennial kingdom is when this will happen. Let's move on to our third covenant that we've studied, and that is the Davidic covenant. Here's our passages right here. 1 Chronicles 17 is really a repeat, something of a repeat of 2 Samuel 7, but listed there nevertheless. Here's the provisions. David's going to have a great name. He's going to have peace. He's going to have a house that will last forever. I take that as his descendants, his posterity. It's going to last forever. He's going to have a throne, power, kingly power and authority. It's going to last forever. And his kingdom will never permanently pass away. So his kingdom, his realm, is never going to permanently pass away. So these are the provisions. And again, the nature of this covenant is unconditional and everlasting. We talked about these to a great extent during our study of the Davidic covenant. There's not really much development to this covenant either. It's sort of given just as it's stated here in the Bible, as it's given in the first occurrence. So there's no real development, but it is perpetuated. And that's one thing we should take it to notice, to observe, is that it is perpetuated. It goes through Solomon, and then it goes through the kings of Judah. So these are the kings of the southern kingdom of the divided kingdom. So think of it like this. So remember, there's a united kingdom. Saul, David, and Solomon all reigned over the united kingdom of Israel. Then, because of Solomon's sin, God says he's going to divide the kingdom up. And there's going to be a northern kingdom, which is called Israel, and a southern kingdom, which is called Judah. It is through the kings of the southern kingdom, through the kingdom of Judah, that David's line is perpetuated. Okay, so it keeps on going. Matter of fact, I think Second Chronicles in particular was written to show us that David's dynasty continued on in the kingdom of Judah. Now, let's think about the fulfillment here. The fulfillment of this covenant happens when the final king of the Davidic dynasty takes his place on the throne of David. This final king is the final king because when he takes the throne, his kingdom will be everlasting. It will never end. The Old Testament and the Gospels are clear that this final king is the Messiah, who we know is Jesus of Nazareth. So this covenant will be fulfilled at the second coming when Jesus returns and takes his place on the throne of David in the city of Jerusalem. And that's all really going to happen. That's not metaphorical language. That's not spiritualized language. That is literal, plain language. When Jesus returns, we call it the second coming, which comes after the tribulation, right before the millennial kingdom. When he returns, he's going to sit on the throne of David, and he will be the last, the final Davidic king. And of course, his reign is not going to be ended. Okay, let's go to the final covenant that we looked at. And that's the new covenant. Again, main passage, Jeremiah 31 through 34. There's lots of other Old Testament passages related to this covenant. There's a few in the New Testament related to this covenant. We covered all of that in our study of the new covenant. The provisions. So this covenant involves the entire nation of Israel. And I should also say at this point, it only involves the nation of Israel. Okay, the new covenant is a covenant that God makes with the nation of Israel. He does not make the new covenant with any other people. It's not to the Gentiles. It's not to the church. It's to the nation of Israel. So, secondly, it produces an internal or spiritual change in the nation. Okay, God writes his law on their hearts. Okay, he gives them a new spirit, puts his spirit in them. It produces an innate knowledge of God in the sense that all Israel will know God in a personal way. They don't need somebody to teach them, as the way the passage puts it. It's innate in them. They have it in them. And it provides forgiveness of sins. This is where the forgiveness of sins. So the sacrifices of the Mosaic law, where people offered sacrifice for sin, those were all prefiguring and pointing to the sacrifice that would have to be made, the death that would be that would take place in order to ratify the new covenant. It's all pointing to that, because that death, the death that ratifies the new covenant, actually provides the forgiveness of sins. None of the sacrifices of the Old Testament did that. So the nature, again, is unconditional and everlasting. The development, I think the development you can see here is that in Jeremiah chapter 31, we have the promise. This is the promise of the new covenant. And then we have the ratification of the new covenant by the death of Jesus Christ on the cross. And the ratification of the new covenant is referred to in the New Testament in those passages that we know as the Lord's Supper passages. Okay? Yeah, in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and in 1 Corinthians. Okay, and mentions Jesus having this last Passover supper with his disciples. And he mentions this cup as the blood of the new covenant, or the new covenant in my blood. And this was talking about the ratification of the new covenant. It's the thing that puts the new covenant into force. The new covenant, at this point, after the death of Christ, can now be fulfilled. Up to that point, couldn't be fulfilled. Right? So this is the development of the new covenant. And the fulfillment of the new covenant is seen at the end of the tribulation before the second coming. Okay? I think it's going to happen before the second coming, either at the very end of the tribulation or towards the end of the tribulation. We see that the new covenant is fulfilled. And it enables Israel to say, when Jesus returns, it enables Israel to say, "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And that's required. That's what they have to say. "Blessed is he who comes in the name of the Lord." And this shows that they have accepted Jesus as their Messiah. And this is speaking of their salvation. So this is the new covenant fulfilled sometime around the end of the tribulation, but before the second coming, and in coordination with the second coming. Certainly before the millennium, the new covenant is fulfilled. Now, I want to end by talking about the connection between the covenants. The connection between the covenants. And I want to show you a little diagram that I think kind of represents these covenants. So first we have the Abrahamic covenant. Okay, that's the red circle in the middle. Then we have the land covenant. Now, maybe on your screen you can't tell so well, but that should be brown, the color of dirt, right? The land covenant. So you see the land covenant overlaps with the Abrahamic covenant, and that's just symbolizing for us that this land covenant is part and parcel to the Abrahamic covenant. The Abrahamic covenant includes a promise of land, and we see this covenant overlap. Then there's the Davidic covenant. Of course, purple is the royal color, so we chose purple for the Davidic covenant. And again, this overlaps with the Abrahamic covenant and the land covenant. So a king's not much of a king if they don't have a kingdom. They got to have a realm. And when we talk about the Davidic covenant, the dynasty of David, it involves a real land area that David ruled. Okay, and this is all a part of the Abrahamic covenant and includes the land covenant. And finally, we have the new covenant. Green symbolizing new growth of things, so the new covenant. And it's connected to the other three. So you see there, you have this overlapping. They're all in the middle, and it's all connected to the Abrahamic covenant. All right, so that's my diagram for you. So these covenants provide the framework for understanding what God is doing, according to the Bible, throughout history in general, but specifically with the nation of Israel. As the Old Testament, I think we would all agree, the Old Testament is a Jewish work. Okay, it's totally Jewish. And the New Testament was written almost exclusively by Jews and is based on the Old Testament. It follows that these covenants are not only forming the framework for what God's doing in history, but specifically they're forming the framework of what God is doing with the nation of Israel. And so the Old Testament's a Jewish book. The New Testament is largely Jewish in nature, and because of that, we see that these covenants really are providing us with the framework, the skeleton, for understanding the entire revealed Word of God. Okay, that's why this is so important, because understanding these covenants allows us to see in a broad perspective what is happening in the world, why God has done what He has done, what His plan has been, what parts of it are accomplished, and what parts are yet to be accomplished. We see all this, the biblical covenants here. The Abrahamic covenant provides the foundation for the other covenants, and so is the basis upon which all the other covenants must be built and viewed. So we need to always keep the Abrahamic covenant in mind when we look at these other covenants. In other words, a proper understanding of the other covenants begins with a proper understanding of the Abrahamic covenant. On the other side of that coin, a misunderstanding of the Abrahamic covenant leads to misunderstanding the other covenants. Okay, so get the Abrahamic covenant right, and then you can begin to understand the other covenants. If you get the Abrahamic covenant wrong, then you're going to get the other covenants wrong. Now, although the Abrahamic covenant is the first covenant given, I think we can agree with that. When it comes to the fulfillment of the covenants, the last covenant, the new covenant, is actually the one that is fulfilled first, because it is the fulfillment of the new covenant that enables and starts off the fulfillment of the other covenants. Okay, so get that. The covenants are given in this order: Abrahamic, land, Davidic, new. But when it comes to the fulfillment of those covenants, it's almost reversed. It's almost totally reversed. The new covenant is fulfilled first, because this is what enables the Jews to accept Jesus as their king. And that has to happen. That has to happen before he can take the throne of David. All right? So this is sort of the pattern that we have here. So all these covenants find their fulfillment in the end times, either just before, at, or shortly after the second coming of Jesus Christ. So that's the connection between these covenants. So hopefully that helps us summarize and conclude our study of the covenants. And again, if you got questions, you can contact me through the church website, or those of you at our church, you know my email address. You can ask questions anytime about something. I'm happy to explain if something is unclear or you just need a little bit more explanation. Well, again, we're going to take the rest of December off, and then we will begin studying the kingdom of God as the theme of the Bible here as we get into the new year. So more information will be coming out on that very soon. So the Lord bless you as you continue to live faithfully to Him.